So I'm going to be starting our new teaching series today, which is entitled Who is Jesus? And we'll have there's a PowerPoint to accompany my talk in just a minute. But I just want us to look at that just for a second. The two readings that we've had are both from Mark's Gospel, chapter 3 and chapter 4. I'm not actually going to be referring to the readings this morning, because I'll tell you why in a second. I'm going to sort of be looking at something a little bit from a different viewpoint, a different angle today. But the two readings are chosen specifically because they set out who Jesus is. They actually give us clues to who Jesus is. The first reading gives us clues as to who Jesus is and the power and authority that he has. And the second, from chapter 4, also points at that. And there's a question there. They were terrified. The disciples were terrified. And they asked one another, who is this? Who is this? I wonder, do we ever ask that question? Who is this? Who is this Jesus? What's it all about? Who is he? And what does he mean to you? So to get started, just amongst yourselves, and turn around and just talk, who is Jesus? Who do you think Jesus is? What does that mean to you? Have a chat for 60 seconds or so. I know it's a huge topic. I know it's a huge question, and you could probably spend the rest of the service talking around that. And it's wonderful that we could do that. I am going to apologise that my sermon today is a little bit longer than normal, because it's such a huge topic, and because we are launching this today, and it's the start of a new year, a new teaching program for the year, and it's absolutely essential right at the start of this year that we focus on the most important thing. Who is Jesus? What does that mean for us? What does he mean for us? I'm sure in some of your in your discussions, I'm sure some of you would have said that actually something like, I don't know, to summarise, he's the Son of God. Maybe you would have said he's the Son of God. However, there's so many people that don't even believe in God, let alone that God has a son. That's just too far, a step too far. So I thought today what we'd look at, do this sermon a little bit differently and try to look at evidence. Try to look at some of the stuff that we've got that helps us understand more fully who Jesus actually is, and through him, how we come to know God. So bear with me as I go through it in a slightly different approach, I suppose. What's the evidence? What's the evidence that Jesus actually lived? Well, there's actually quite a lot. There's a lot of documented evidence. This is outside of the Bible. So from other historians, other writers, that tell us about this man named Jesus, who existed, who lived, and the dates are there. It's all there for us. Some of the Roman historians, Tacitus, he writes about him in his teachings. The historian Senutius also writes indirectly about Jesus Christ. When he's writing his accounts of Pontius Pilate, he mentions his intercourse with Jesus Christ and the relationship that they had during Jesus' crucifixion. He writes about that indirectly. And then there's the whole of the New Testament. And the New Testament, the new part of our Bible, they've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the New Testament is all to do with Jesus' life in the Gospels and afterwards, and the teachings and how the church grew. So the New Testament is itself, it's proven by historians from outside of church circles, it's proven by historians to be accurate in date and in time and in lots of the events, the names of places and the cities and all the citations of those things. It's proven to be accurate in so many ways. And it was written between 40 and 100 AD. One of the greatest textual critics, F.J.A. Hort, said this about the New Testament. In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient writings. And there's no historian or scholar that would disagree with that. It stands alone as a text, which is accurate. So we know that Jesus existed. There's so much evidence to tell us that Jesus existed. But who was he? Who was he? Well, we know that he was a man. He was human. That he ate, He drank, he worked, he slept. He would have suffered illness and pain, just as we do with the common cold and flu and all of those things. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He grew up in a family home. He went through a bereavement, losing loved ones and relatives, suffering, pain, and he went through death. Lots of people would say, okay, that's fine, I accept that there was a man named Jesus. We accept that he was a human, that he lived. We accept that. And we also accept that actually he was probably a great person. And he taught wonderful teachings. But that's as far as they're prepared to go. That's as far as they're prepared to accept, because he was only human. But to answer that, let's go through 3 little pieces of evidence. First, let's think about what Jesus said about himself. What did he say about himself? This is a slightly strange one, really, because if you're thinking about the great teachers, the great rabbis of the day, or the great teachers, they would have pointed to somebody else. They would have said what this person said. They would point to the teachings of someone greater than them. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus actually points to himself. And you might say, Jesus is being rather sort of full of himself there. But Jesus was the most humble person ever to have walked this planet. You've only got to look at the way he lived his life, which we'll touch on later. But just to get a glimpse of that, in your own time, read Philippians 2 if you want to know what humility looks like. Read Philippians 2. And Jesus actually points to himself in all of these things, and he says, it's through me that you can come into relationship with God, through me. You've all been here long enough. You've heard me say from the front here lots of time that people are searching for something. People are hungry for something. People are not satisfied, and they're looking for something else. Freud said, people are hungry for love. Jung said, people are hungry for security. And Adler said, people are hungry for significance in life. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. In other words, if you're hungry, you can only be filled by me. Lots of people are depressed in this world. But you've got to read the news at the moment. There's so much dissatisfaction. People are disillusioned. So much unhappiness going on at the moment. Despair. It's a dark place, we could say. Our country and the world at the moment is a dark place. What did Jesus say? I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus also said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. Even though they die, will live. We don't like to talk about death. It's a bit of a taboo subject. People are afraid to talk about dying. There's one statistic that I can categorically give you that is accurate above everything else. Every single person in this room will die at one point. It's 100% guaranteed. Mother Teresa was asked shortly before her death, are you scared of dying? And her answer was brilliant. She said, scared of dying? How can I be? Dying is going home to God. No, on the contrary, she said, I'm actually looking forward to it. A lot of people, they struggle with that. I think those who are long in the faith can see what she's saying around that. We know exactly what she means around that. So there's this sense of dissatisfaction. Lots of people looking for the answer for life, looking for some meaning to life, looking for some purpose. And we look for it in lots of different ways. And that might be through materialism. And I think none of us are blind enough to think that actually we'll get our happiness in that. You're not going to find satisfaction in materialism. So really what we're looking for is this spiritual satisfaction, this reality of knowing spiritually what it's all about. Jesus answers that. Jesus in his teaching says, I am the way, I am the way. People are looking for values in life, values on which they can base their lives. Jesus says, I am the truth. And I think all of us would want some kind of ultimate meaning, some kind of ultimate purpose to life. Jesus says, I am the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Other people might teach something else and say, oh no, that's the way, follow that way. Or they might say, oh, that's the truth, or that's the way to live your life. No, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then he goes on to say, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. If you've seen me, you've seen God. There's this famous illustration, I'm sure you've heard it, famous illustration of a child who is drawing a picture. And her mum says to her, what are you doing? And she says, oh, I'm drawing a picture of God. To which she says, oh, don't be silly, love. No one knows what God looks like. To which she says, well, they do now. And holds the picture up. Jesus says, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. And then the second piece of evidence is a kind of indirect sort of piece of evidence, really. Jesus says a number of things which, although they weren't direct claims that he made to be God, they show that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. So, for example, Jesus said to the people, your sins are forgiven. Your sins are forgiven. To forgive those who've sinned against us is something that we can all do. So I can forgive someone who's wronged me. That's in my sort of heart to do. I can forgive you if you've upset me. But to forgive those who sinned against others is not my right to do that. Only God can do that. The third piece of evidence is Jesus' own direct claims. There's this famous passage in the Bible, I'm sure you'll know it, which after Jesus' death and resurrection, he appears to his disciples. But Thomas, who's one of the disciples, wasn't there. He missed this encounter with the risen Christ. And the others say to Thomas, we've seen the Lord. He's risen and we've seen him. And Thomas, who gets a bad reputation as being called Doubting Thomas, really just being human, like you or I would have said in that exact moment, said, oh, whatever. I don't think so. Unless I see him, and unless I touch the wounds, then I will not believe, he says. And then we jump to this amazing passage in John 20, verse 26. Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. And then Thomas said, my Lord and my God. In that moment, he acknowledged Jesus as Lord and God. And what did Jesus do? He didn't then suddenly say, whoa, hang on a minute, Thomas, that's just a bit too far. What he said was this, because you've seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So that's the first part, if you like, of the argument. So what did Jesus say about himself? Obviously, when someone says something about themselves, those claims need to be tested, don't they? So there's lots of things that we could do to test those claims. People today might sort of claim all kinds of things. So you might have heard lots of people still, for instance, think that Elvis is still alive, somewhere, living somewhere, doing something. Lots of people claim that Bruce Lee is still alive and actually on some far off island building an army of martial artists ready to come back and take over the world. That's a claim that people are making. How do we test these claims? Jesus' claim is something else. Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God. God in the flesh. So experts will say that because of his claim, there are three possibilities. You'll have probably heard these. There's three possibilities that we can take from that claim. The first is this, that it wasn't true. Jesus' claim, it just wasn't true. and that Jesus himself knew it wasn't true. In which case, he was a fraudster, and in which case he was an imposter, and a pretty evil one at that, really, doing what he was doing and claiming what he was claiming. It was a pretty evil thing if that's the case. The second possibility is that it was not true, that he wasn't the Son of God, but that Jesus actually thought he was. That he wasn't really, but Jesus thought he was. And again, in which case, he was completely deluded. You could say he was insane and of not right of mind. But the other option, the third option, is what C.S. Lewis says, is this. I think there's the next slide. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg or something, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or a madman, or something worse. So what's the evidence to support what he said about himself, that he is the Son of God? What's the evidence? Well, there's Jesus' teachings. The teachings of Jesus are the foundation of life, really, particularly in the Western world. Many of our laws are based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. As a people, we've made massive, massive strides. I mean, technology alone in the last 25 years has just blown our minds how far we've moved. We've made huge strides in technology and science, but no one has ever improved on the teachings of Jesus Christ. They are the greatest words ever spoken by anyone. I can say things here, you'll forget what I've said here by the time you walk out the door. And yet Jesus' teachings have stood over 2,000 years, and no one can improve upon them, because they're the kind of words that only God himself could speak. And then what about his lifestyle? So it's not just what he said, it's what he did. What about his lifestyle? Jesus must have been the most amazing person to be around. It must have just been incredible to follow Jesus, to walk with him, to see what he did, to hear him. We hear in the Bible how the crowds went wherever he went. They wanted a glimpse. They wanted to just capture what it was that he had, to be a part of that. Could you imagine? I mean, some people say they don't want to become a Christian because that means they'll have to be boring from then on, because they can't have any fun anymore once you become a Christian. How wrong? How wrong is that? Could you imagine actually going to a party with Jesus? You'd never run out of the best wine, would you? Jesus turning water into wine, you'd never run out of that. Could you imagine going on a hospital visit with Jesus? People would be getting up out of the beds with all kinds of everything healed. It would be amazing. Miracles all over the place. It would be incredible. Could you imagine going on a picnic? You wouldn't need to take a backpack or anything, because Jesus could provide like he did for 5,000 on the hillside. Could you imagine? You get my point, don't you? You get what I'm trying to say. It's not just the miracles and the way that he did those miracles. It's the way that he lived, and this is the crucial bit, the way that he loved. The miracles were one thing, but they showed God's love in the way that they were enacted, in the way that they happened. Because he loved the loveless. He cared for the outcasts. He cured the diseases of those who were shunned by society. He loved them. That was the difference. It was the way that he lived and the way that he loved and the way that he changed people's lives. And the way that he still changes people's lives today. And then there's his death. So there's his life and then there's his death. And the way that he died, his sacrifice on the cross made for each and every one of us, freely laying down his life. I'll touch on his death in just a minute as well. But also there's the Old Testament. I mentioned the New Testament, but there's the Old Testament. And the Old Testament was written way before Jesus was even born. There's no one else in the history of humanity who's had an entire library of books written about them before they were even born. That's the Old Testament. In a nutshell, the Old Testament points to Jesus Christ. And then we have Jesus in the New Testament. The Old Testament points to him. A whole library of books. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies from the Old Testament, and he fulfilled 29 of them in one day on the cross on Good Friday. As I just said before, another piece of evidence, which is perhaps the most important, is his death and his resurrection. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the absolute cornerstone of Christianity. What is the evidence of the resurrection? What's the evidence? Bishop Tom Wright, who's an amazing theologian, he wrote this: "The Christian claim is not that Jesus is to be understood in terms of a God about whom we already know. It is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that creator is to be seen in terms of, through the lens of, Jesus Christ." The resurrection points to the fact that we have a creator which we can meet through the lens of Jesus Christ. I haven't got long enough to go into what that is. There's loads in there. But there are a number of crucial bits of things for us to think about around the resurrection. We know that Jesus died. It's accounted for in historians' writings, not just the Gospels. Other writings account for Jesus' death on the cross. But it's also accounted in the Gospels, which I've already proved are accurate. But they also say something else. The Gospels say something which is crucial about Jesus' death. And this was written before our understanding of science is what it is today. They wrote this: that a spear was thrust into Jesus' side as he hung on the cross. And as the spear was put into his side, blood and water flowed out. Now, they didn't know what they were writing when they wrote that because we didn't have the science at the time. But today, with modern science, we know that when blood and water flow out, there's been a separation of something or other, and that can only happen when the person is dead. Jesus was truly dead on that cross. Some would argue then, what happened? What happened with his body? Others say that perhaps the Roman authorities took Jesus' body. People were claiming that he was risen, but others say, well, no, because his body was taken and hidden away by the authorities, either the Romans or the Jewish authorities. But there's no chance. There's no chance that they would have hidden his body away. Because when the stories of Jesus' resurrection were starting to grow and people were saying they've seen him, and you can imagine that once that starts to get this effect, all the authorities would have to do at that point was say, sorry, you're talking rubbish. We've got the body and here it is. He's completely dead. They didn't do that. They didn't quash the stories of his resurrection because there was no body for them to do that. They couldn't. Others would say, well, that's because robbers stole the body. Robbers broke in and stole it because the tomb was empty. Well, let's think about that logically just for a minute. Could robbers get past the Roman guard? What we know about Roman soldiers and who they were, really get past the Roman guard? Could robbers really roll the stone away secretly that no one would see that happening? And then when they went into the tomb, what's documented is that they found Jesus' grave clothes as if his body had literally, they say the grave clothes were in situ where he lay. It's as if his body had kind of gone through them, and the clothing sort of just lay flat, a bit like when perhaps a butterfly comes out of a cocoon. It's there; it just goes flat. And then he said, and that the scarf that covered his head was folded neatly and put back in place. That's not the work of robbers, is it? Who come in haste to get in and get out without being seen. What a robber would do is get in, nick everything they could, and leg it. They wouldn't be leaving things neatly folded. And actually, a robber would steal the grave clothes because that was the most valuable thing in there. The grave shroud was actually a valuable piece. They would have stolen that if they were going to steal anything. And then there's the multitude of people who claim they saw Jesus. There's the personal accounts of people who encountered the risen Jesus. Now, some would say, well, that was just one or two people making a claim, try and get a big news story and make up this story that he'd risen. On one occasion, we're talking about 500 people who saw him. 500 people. Are they all going to make up the same claim? Are they all going to be that sort of delusional and make up this story? And then there's the number of millions of people who've had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ since then, up to today. Millions of people whose lives have been changed by their encounter with Jesus across the world. Is every one of those countless millions got it wrong? Are we all deluded? Seriously? I'm coming to an end. Sherlock Holmes said this: when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however implausible, must be the truth. So when we look at the claims of Jesus, who he said he was, and the possibilities of him being evil or deluded, well, we can rule that out. There's no way Jesus was evil or deluded. That can be ruled out completely. When we look at his teachings, the way that he lived his life, his character, the fulfillment of those prophecies, his resurrection from the dead, those explanations, well, to say that he was evil or deluded is just absurd, isn't it? It's just absurd. So therefore, the point that Sherlock Holmes was making is this: when you eliminate those, whatever remains must be truth. And actually, when you look at that, they give you the strongest support that Jesus' own consciousness of being a man whose identity was actually God is true. Jesus Christ is God in the flesh. To me, there's no other explanation. C.S. Lewis puts it way better than I could possibly put it. So to finish, he says this: we are faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we are talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane, or something worse. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. Who is Jesus? Well, he's God in the flesh. And over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be exploring a little bit more about what that means for us. If I've said something today that perhaps has made you think for the first time, maybe you're questioning around all of this, then we've got a course that's starting on the 1st of February, Wednesday the 1st of February, which is called our What If course. If you've got questions, what if Jesus really is God? What if Jesus did die on the cross? What if I read the Bible? What if I pray? What if I become a Christian? What if? If they're your questions, then the What If course is absolutely for you. It's 6 weeks. It's 7:30 in the side room here. We normally meet in the cricket club, but for circumstances, we're in the side room here this time. 7:30 till 9 o'clock. Refreshments will be served. It's dead easy going. It's conversational. It's not heavy. It's relaxed. We get to know each other in a really good way. Good friendships are formed. And hopefully we can journey on that understanding of who is Jesus and what it means. If you want to join the What If course, please let me know and I can put you on the list.